many of the demonstrations involved an element of violence as well, but the media emphasized the peaceful demonstrations, and there were peaceful demonstrations, but I just wanted to indicate that they were illegal, that they involved building of barricades and that kind of thing. And the opposition, in their use of the slogan, "Free political prisoners," didn't distinguish between maybe some of the people who were jailed. They were jailed because the demonstrations were illegal, but perhaps some of them were participating in peaceful demonstrations, and the violent ones that you're referring to. And so the impression that the media, the corporate media in the United States and elsewhere made was that all the demonstrations were peaceful. In fact, the New York Times published an article comparing Leopoldo Lopez, who led the demonstrations in 2014, with Martin Luther King, and that was quite deceptive.
I'll never apologize for the United States of America, ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the truly moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
Moderate
rebels.
All right, so I'm Max Blumenthal here in the Moderate Rebels bunker. That was your psychedelic NPR theme. And I'm here with Steve Elner, someone who has a wealth of knowledge on what's happening in Venezuela because Steve has lived it for the past several decades. He has been a professor. He's a retired professor from the University of the East, Universidad del Oriente in Caracas.
Outside of Caracas.
Outside of Caracas. And Steve has been on a speaking tour in the U.S. about sanctions on Venezuela. And you have a forthcoming book on the pink tide. Tell us just about the book and what you've been doing in the U.S.
Okay. Two questions. One is the book. It will be out next year, published by Rowman and Littlefield, and it's on the pink tide governments. Now that there has been a right-wing pushback throughout the continent, it's important to analyze the experience of the progressive governments that were in power in the early years of the 21st century, in Brazil with Lula, in Argentina with the Kirchners, in Venezuela with Chavez and Maduro. And actually there's a chapter on each one, most of the pink tide governments, and it attempts to analyze the positive aspects and also the shortcomings. With regard to my tour, it was basically a 2-month tour throughout Canada and the United States. I was really surprised by the enthusiasm. I think that has something to do with President Trump's aggressive discourse and talk of possible military intervention. I think that has created a certain degree of concern among people in the United States, the possibility of another U.S. Front in this perpetual, war throughout the world. So that indicates I was really quite surprised by the turnout, and also the solidarity groups that have been in existence now for some time. Solidarity with Cuba and now solidarity with Venezuela.
And you got a lot of support, too. I mean, you're talking about these long-standing solidarity organizations. There's been a deliberate attempt to actually break solidarity between the pink tide governments, not just Venezuela, but Nicaragua as well, and progressive organizations in the U.S., and you still see strong links there.
Yes. I think the way that is happening is that a number of people who have been active in the solidarity movement have developed a very critical position towards the governments of Nicaragua and Venezuela. Specifically with regard to Venezuela, I'm also critical. I have my criticisms of the government of Maduro and, to perhaps a lesser extent, Chavez himself. I've got my criticisms. But I think there's a distinction that has to be made between a critical position and a position that basically states that the government of Maduro is as bad or almost as bad as the position of the opposition, the radical opposition that wants regime change in Venezuela. And even though some of those people may state that they are opposed to the sanctions and certainly opposed to military intervention in Venezuela. If you basically feel that Maduro hasn't done anything right and that the Maduro government should be replaced because he himself is responsible for the critical economic situation in Venezuela, and you start talking about violation of human rights, it's very difficult for somebody to maintain that position and at the same time oppose the sanctions. There's so many other causes that somebody, a progressive person who is involved in solidarity work, is going to go elsewhere because why defend a government that is basically doing a lot of harm? So I think that my position is that the solidarity people, in addition to opposing the sanctions, on the grounds that sanctions are illegal by international law, and on grounds that they have never been successful, they've only produced harm for the population as a whole in the countries where the sanctions have been applied. That is unilateral sanctions. In addition to that, the solidarity movement has to have pretty clear in their mind that although mistakes have been made, and we all have the right to have an opinion with regard to errors that have been committed, incidentally, Maduro himself says that, recognizes that there have been errors. But in addition to that, I think we have to know something about Venezuela and know something about the positive aspects of the Chavez government that Maduro has retained in terms of social policy, in terms of foreign policy, and other issues.
Yeah, and you mentioned the extreme right-wing opposition. Can you talk more about the tactics it's used? In the Western corporate media, we've seen almost universal, uncritical support for the opposition and the portrayal of the government as the sole purveyor of violence, as if only the government has been killing people. But what we've actually seen on the ground, and maybe you could speak more about, are attacks from the opposition. Of course, you can talk about the Garimbas, but also bombing. I mean, there have been numerous bombings of government offices. We even saw this, far-right figure hijack a helicopter and attack government buildings, and he was lauded in the U.S. media as a James Bond figure.
Yes, and I think that there is an intentional strategy or policy of not distinguishing between protests that are peaceful, even though they're illegal, because all the protests in 2017 and in 2014, almost without exception, perhaps there were a few exceptions, but they were illegal in that they blocked traffic and the protesters built barricades and fires and placed big boulders on streets in strategic areas of different cities, not to create a situation of paralyzing traffic for one day, but for 4 months, because those protests, the Guarimba protests that you mentioned, that's a term that's used in Venezuela, basically civil disobedience, which is a good word in the United States, but really I wouldn't compare that kind of civil disobedience with Gandhi or Martin Luther King, because he never did that kind of thing.
I mean, people were burned alive by the opposition, but they were targeting particularly black people. They were targeting Chavistas. I was in Nicaragua, where we saw the same kind of violence, and Venezuelan opposition members had actually gone to Nicaragua to coach the violent members of the opposition there, who were maintaining these tranques, the roadblocks, on basically how to fuck shit up. I mean, how to really destroy the country from within. And yet, we actually saw someone, I don't know if it was a Human Rights Watch panel, but it was a panel on human rights. He just left Venezuela. He was let out of prison, and he had been recorded talking about, training snipers. He had been involved in paramilitary activity in Colombia, and now he's on a panel talking about human rights. He's posed with Jose Maria Vivanco from Human Rights Watch in a photo. I think you know who I'm talking about. He's a young man. But, you've seen the lauding of violent elements in Venezuela. I guess that phase seems to be dormant right now. Where we just saw local elections in Venezuela, where I guess you could say Chavista elements, not all from the governing party, but from pro-Chavez, pro-Bolivarian revolution elements have cut deep into the support base of the opposition in local elections. The opposition seems totally fragmented since 2017. Where are they right now, and to what extent can their own fragmentation and internal rifts not be attributed to like government repression? I guess I want to tie that into the critique of Venezuela that we hear in the U.S. as a regime that represses the opposition deliberately, that dissolved the National Assembly and created a constituent assembly. You know, how much democracy is there, and what is the state of the opposition?
Okay, first, I just wanted to pick up on the point that I was making with regard to the peaceful demonstrations. I didn't want to leave the impression that I'm disagreeing with you. Many of the demonstrations involved an element of violence as well, but the media emphasized the peaceful demonstrations, and there were peaceful demonstrations, but I just wanted to indicate that they were illegal, that they involved building of barricades and that kind of thing. And the opposition, in their use of the slogan, "Free political prisoners," didn't distinguish between maybe some of the people who were jailed. They were jailed because the demonstrations were illegal, but perhaps some of them were participating in peaceful demonstrations, and the violent ones that you're referring to. And so the impression that the media, the corporate media in the United States and elsewhere made was that all the demonstrations were peaceful. In fact, the New York Times published an article comparing Leopoldo Lopez, who led the demonstrations in 2014, with Martin Luther King. And that was quite deceptive.
And he's a right-wing oligarch who is, you know, from one of the oldest oligarchic families that has just been involved in ravaging Venezuela. I mean...
Right. He is actually the grandson of the brother and associate of the guy who was the Rockefeller of Venezuela, Eugenio Mendoza, going back to the 1940s. From the 1940s until the 1980s, when he passed away, he was the richest person in Venezuela. And his associate was one of his brothers, who was Leopoldo Lopez's grandfather.
And his cousin is Thor Halvorsen, who runs this fake human rights group that pretty much trumps up regime change from North Korea to Venezuela to pretty much anywhere that's targeted by the U.S.
Right.
So definite Martin Luther King liberation theology, Riverside Baptist Church righteousness there. You know, let justice roll down like, you know, a million J.P. Morgan stocks.
Right. Good comparison.
Let justice roll down like trickle-down economics. No, but what's also interesting about that, you mentioned the New York Times and many other corporate media outlets, right, just publishing these hagiographies about Leopoldo Lopez as the savior of the world. What's even crazier in my mind is that some outlets even published articles acknowledging that the opposition was waging war against the Venezuelan state. And I remember the Washington Post ran a kind of surreal story talking about all the creative uses of weapons that the opposition had originated, like gluing nails on the end of sticks and like making like these makeshift weapons. We also see like mortars, something similar to Nicaragua, where the media was like not only whitewashing the violence, but actually in some ways praising the ingenuity of the new forms of violence that the opposition was carrying out.
It's like the Washington Post editorial board is suddenly endorsing Antifa in the U.S. Like, would you ever see that? Well, actually, more is akin to the Proud Boys.
Oh, much more like the Proud Boys.
You know, so some of the people in the opposition justified the violent tactics of some of the demonstrations, saying that we were just retaliating. We were retaliating. There was police repression, and this was our response. In 2014, they retaliated and killed 6 National Guardsmen and 1 or 2 policemen. And the fact of the matter is, I mean, there was excesses on the part of the security forces that some of the National Guardsmen or some of the security forces were jailed in the 2017 protests. But the fact of the matter is that in the United States or Canada or any other country, any of the other developed countries of the world, in response to police excesses, if demonstrators were to shoot policemen or shoot people, National Guardsmen, we know full well what the results would have been. So that even in the context of police or security forces, the excesses of the security forces, still, that's no justification for the shooting of security forces. So this is part of the narrative of the opposition, which really doesn't convince anybody.
Yes, and that's really, I think, what part of why they are marginalized right now. But let's bring it up to date and get more into the issues of sanctions. I mean, what's the situation? Because I haven't been to Venezuela. What's the situation now? Is it as bad as our media is reporting? We constantly see these streams of refugees leaving, and they're making it seem like we need to have a We Are the World concert for Venezuela. It's used to drive the case not only for regime change, but a kind of humanitarian military intervention. Inflation is skyrocketing. It's going to 1 million%, we're told. Right. There's no denying that things are not as they should be and as they have been under Chavez. So what's the situation like, and why is it that way in your view?
Okay, well, firstly, the media may be exaggerating a little bit. In fact, they do, with regard to the economic situation in Venezuela. But they're not exaggerating by much. The situation in Venezuela is very difficult. The hyperinflation that you mentioned, and also the purchasing power, that people don't have the purchasing power that they had just a few years back. So that the situation is serious. Also, the immigration the media exaggerates in terms of the statistics that they use, but not by much, because there is a mass exodus of people from Venezuela across the political spectrum. People in the opposition, some Chavistas, young people, old people. So that's a serious situation that nobody can really deny. But the narrative of the opposition and much of the media in the United States, there is a discussion of the economic situation, a description of what's happening on the ground, and then they throw in the violation of human rights. And people who aren't particularly analytical, they know that the economic situation is difficult. Perhaps they know some Venezuelans, or they've had firsthand experience with people, or they have talked to people who have had firsthand experience in Venezuela, and say they know that is a reality. And they just assume that the one paragraph in the case of an article that mentions flagrant violation of human rights on the part of the Maduro government or violation of democratic norms, they just assume that is also accurate.
And the OAS is just constantly hammering that. That's Luis Almagro's leitmotif now.
Right.
In fact, Luis Almagro, the Secretary General of the OAS, has openly suggested that there should be a foreign military intervention to overthrow Venezuela's government.
Yeah, well, he seconded Trump's statement about the military option. And incidentally, the rightist governments in South America rejected that. As right as they are, they issued a statement saying that they are not in agreement with military intervention in Venezuela, probably because they are afraid of a reaction within their own countries. But in any case, that is the question is, if they have enough to go on with regard to the difficult economic situation in Venezuela, why do they have to lie about the violation of democratic norms? Why do they have to exaggerate? Why do they have to cherry pick with regard to what's happening on that front? And the reason is that a difficult economic situation does not justify any kind of intervention. If that was your criterion, then you would be justifying intervention and sanctions throughout Africa, throughout Latin America, throughout the underdeveloped world. So the only way that that Almagro and the Trump administration and the corporate media can justify sanctions against Venezuela is by going beyond that narrative about the difficult economic situation and the situation with the immigrants and talk about the state of Venezuelan democracy.
I interviewed John Ackerman, who's a professor at UNAM, very close to Andres Manuel López Obrador and the Morena movement in Mexico. And he had a very provocative article in La Jornada comparing Mexico and the state of Mexican democracy, or supposed democracy, to Venezuelan democracy, and arguing that Mexico is actually far less democratic than Venezuela. Yet it never is condemned at the OAS.
And also, not only is Mexico far less democratic, it has much more violence and much more poverty.
Yes, I mean, you saw hundreds, literally hundreds of candidates in this recent election picked off and murdered one by one. And we heard very little about that in the U.S. What do you make of that critique?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, not only is John Ackerman saying that, but also López Obrador as well. In a recent statement, he said, there's so much reporting on the situation in Venezuela with regard to human rights, with regard to violence, with regard to criminal activity on the ground in Venezuela, and very little about Mexico. And he made that same statement, that the situation in Mexico is as bad, probably worse than Mexico with regard to criminal activity, with regard to violation of human rights, and with regard to violation of democratic norms. So that I think it's interesting that López Obrador's position may signal a new trend. That coupled with the position of Sanchez, the Sanchez government in Spain, Sanchez, who was critical of Maduro a while back, but now as president, he says, I want to play a constructive, positive role in dialogue, in promoting dialogue in Venezuela. And I'm not going to do that if I criticize one side or the other. So I'm going to play a neutral position. I'm going to not criticize either side and use my office in order to bring about some kind of dialogue. And he's just picking up from where Rodríguez Zapatero, who belongs to the same party, the Socialist Party of Spain, has been trying to do for the last couple of years, promoting dialogue between the opposition and the Maduro government.
You were talking about, I want to get back into that later, the kind of geopolitical situation, not just in the region, but with the U.S. But I wanted to stay on the issue of the economy in Venezuela because, irrespective of the human rights situation, we constantly hear about it, and it's very rare to have it put into context. The economy functions in a drastically different way in Venezuela than Americans can understand. You have this issue of exchanges, and I'm going to read you a quote by someone who you might know, Julio Escalona.
Yes, I do.
Who's a professor at Central University in Caracas. And
a leftist from way back. He was involved in the guerrilla movement. He was the president of the student movement at the Central University in the early 60s.
Right. So he's, been an active supporter of the Bolivarian Revolution. And he attributes the economic crisis here to a right-wing tactic. He says the right is permanently raising prices. The right does this because it's what most hurts the people. As a result, you cannot buy a kilo of meat. Nobody can buy it, nor can you buy a kilo of chicken. That's to say the basic goods that people use can't be bought, but neither can you get anything else. When they become aware that the people were eating vegetables, then they raise the prices. Whenever they see the population is beginning to turn, the right immediately hikes up prices to reduce people to a situation of defenselessness. And that, I don't know if is he referring to the big companies in Colombia that import food that are, raising prices for political tactics, the exchanges. What does he mean by that? And how can you explain what's happening there to an American audience that doesn't have to deal with that kind of situation?
Right. Well, firstly, the situation is complex, and there are several factors that are important that are at play. One is the manipulation of the exchange rate. And that's important, especially for a country like Venezuela that depends so much on imports. Venezuela is called a port economy because just like other Latin American countries, but even more so because of the oil, Venezuela has always been dependent on imports. And how do you pay for imports? Through dollars. And so the people who are buying the imports, who are importing items, the merchants, have to go to the government in order to purchase dollars. And so the exchange rate is extremely important. Going back, and this isn't Chavez's doing, going back to the early 1980s, there has been off and on a system of exchange controls, which means that the importers get a certain preferential exchange rate, but those who are going to use dollars in order to save them in bank accounts in the United States or any other use of dollars, they have to go to the open market, or actually the black market rate, which is a lot higher. There's a manipulation of that black market rate, and the evidence is everybody knows that the main point of reference for that exchange rate is Dollar Today. That's an online information which people access, and that serves to guide people as to what the exchange rate is. But everybody also knows that the real exchange rate is below that. At least it was up until recently. So that that exchange rate is constantly going up. There's a manipulation.
Because Dollar Today is artificially inflating exchange rates.
Not only that, but Dollar Today is a political portal. You can Google it, and you'll see that there's a lot of information, a lot of political information on that site, and it's all anti-government. It's all anti-Maduro. And everybody has opinions about politics, but you access a page that has to do with the stock exchange. You're not going to get political propaganda on that page. Right. They're interested in, accuracy and credibility. But in the case of Dollar Today, it's, propaganda in opposition to Maduro. So obviously there's a political agenda, and that has something to do with the manipulation of the currency.
Who is behind Dollar Today?
Well, it was established by a guy named Eligio Cedeno, who was involved in corruption, or was accused of being corrupt, precisely because of the manipulation of the exchange rate. He had considered himself to be pro-Chavez, but like a lot of people, he was pro-Chavez in order to try to get favors from the government. He was jailed by Chavez, and under very suspicious circumstances, which I won't go into it because it's kind of a lot of details there. But he left. He left the country. He was let out of prison, and the ambassador in Venezuela basically stated in a cable that WikiLeaks published that this guy was corrupt, but that the United States ought to open its doors to him, to allow him into the United States. So he's the founder of Dollar Today, and it's a political organization. This guy is rabidly anti-Chavez and now anti-Maduro. So obviously politics has a lot to do with it. But I just want to say that there are other factors as well. The opposition claims that the difficult economic situation in Venezuela is due to the blunders of the Maduro government, and that Maduro is to blame 100%. Nevertheless, all Venezuelans know, including the opposition, that the Venezuelan economy is dependent on the price of oil. Nobody can possibly deny that, because historically that has been the pattern going back to the 1920s, when Venezuela became the leading world exporter of oil, which it was up until 1970. So that's been the historical pattern. Now, when Chavez was president, throughout the years that he was president, the price of oil increased. So that was an advantage for Chavez. It was going from very low levels to very high levels. In the case of Maduro, it's been just the opposite. Right. It began when he assumed the presidency in April of 2013. The price of the dollar, the price of oil was, Venezuelan oil, was over $100 a barrel. And it nosedived beginning in August of 2014. So Maduro was in power for just 1 year, a little over 1 year, when the price of oil declined and it reached about $35 a barrel, from $100 to $35. So that is part of the problem. And I would say that another part of the problem is the economic sanctions that nobody can deny either.
I saw a chart, by the way, of exports of, I think it was Mexican oil versus Venezuelan oil. It might not have been Mexican, but it was another competitor country, and it showed that they were basically about steady. They were competing, and then when the sanctions kicked in under Trump, Venezuelan export sales just immediately plummeted, which is a key factor in driving the economic output down.
Right. Not only that, Ben, but
Max.
I'm sorry, Max.
I'm a head floating in this black space over here.
My grandfather's name was Max, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah, maybe that's why I got you confused. I didn't quite see my grandfather.
He must have been a great guy. You got to live up to that name.
Okay, I'm trying to.
Remember Max Kaminsky? Trombone player?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an old-time name that kind of came back, and now it's like becoming a hipster name.
Okay.
When I was born, actually, it was mostly a name for dogs.
Okay.
But back to sanctions. So
Okay. Not only what you just mentioned, but also the fact that Francisco Rodriguez, who was the main economic advisor of Henry Falcon, the main rival to Maduro in the 2018 elections, who is well connected here in the United States, is a banker, used to work for Bank of America, and now works for Torino Capital. And he knows the ropes here in the United States, and he also knows Venezuela quite well. I mean, he's Venezuelan. He's a son. He's a son of an important political figure in Venezuela going back to the 1960s and 1970s, who was a minister. So this guy knows what he's talking about. He publishes in Foreign Policy, the magazine, which is anything but leftist, and he has stated that the sanctions have had a big effect on Venezuela, the Venezuelan economy, and specifically the Venezuelan oil industry. So there's really no denying the fact that the sanctions have had a big effect on Venezuela.
Yeah, and let's talk more about the price of oil, because the idea that this sudden decrease by more than 1/3 in the price of oil, or the sudden decrease from the original price down to 1/3 of what it had been, the idea is that that's some organic development and that's the market acting naturally. But I've also seen some research that indicates that that could have been an intentional strategy pursued by the Obama administration around 2014, before there was this kind of slight split over Saudi Arabia, back when this support for Saudi Arabia was bipartisan and unquestioned. But the argument I've seen is that the U.S. pressured Saudi Arabia to overproduce oil intentionally, to flood the market with oil, and therefore drop the price.
which Trump has been trying to do to crash Iran's economy recently. I mean,
Absolutely.
It's a clear tactic.
It's a pretty concerted campaign, and the arguments I've seen is that in 2014, this was done expressly to hinder the Venezuelan, Russian, and Iranian economies, and now we continue to see it under Trump. And what's interesting is that we've seen fights at what are called OPEC Plus negotiations, adding Russia to OPEC, where Saudi Arabia and Russia have agreed, and the U.S. has actually, in some ways, sometimes been fighting against Saudi Arabia and Russia, and then sometimes Saudi Arabia and Russia have been fighting, or have been allied with the U.S., and Venezuela and Iran have been pushing for a decrease in the production so the price can rise again.
Yeah, Venezuela historically was a moderate within OPEC. It was a moderate in between Saudi Arabia, which was conservative in terms of favoring more production and lower prices, as opposed to the radical wing of OPEC, consisting of Algeria, Iraq, Iran, and Libya, which favored decreasing production in order to maintain prices at higher levels. Venezuela was a moderate. When Chavez was elected president, he played an activist role, firstly in attempting to stabilize prices, which was really to everybody's advantage, but stabilizing prices at upper levels. And he did that by traveling in the year 2000, throughout Latin America, throughout the world, to invite all the OPEC countries to the second OPEC summit that was held in Caracas in September of 2000, in which he proposed, and his proposal was accepted, to maintain prices between $22 and $28 a barrel, which was really an upper level at that time. So Chavez had a lot to do with the increase in the price of oil. Oil had, throughout a period of almost 2 decades, had decreased quite a bit in the 1980s and 1990s. So the increase in the price of oil, which favored, Venezuela and favored the OPEC countries, that's what OPEC is all about, had a lot to do with Chavez's activist diplomacy.
Now we're seeing a very open assault on Venezuela, where the U.S. is actually attempting to openly restrict oil exports. It wants, am I correct? The U.S. wants to actually stop all oil exports from Venezuela.
I don't know whether that's the end game, but I think that's what Trump had in mind. Yeah. But there was opposition from the oil companies, specifically the oil companies that depend on Venezuelan oil. The refineries that refine Venezuelan oil are not really suited to refine oil from other countries. They're suited for Venezuelan oil, so that if Venezuelan oil was kept out of the United States, those companies would be hurt in a big way. So there was pressure on Trump not to go quite that far.
And that is the end to part 1 of our discussion here at Moderate Rebels with Professor Steve Elner. Join us in part 2, and you can hear our discussion on the effects of U.S. sanctions on Venezuela, the U.S. economic war, and how the bipartisan policy that began under Obama has continued even more aggressively under Donald Trump, and specifically his neoconservative national security advisor, John Bolton. You can support Moderate Rebels and the work we do at Patreon. Please go to patreon.com/moderaterebels, where you can consider becoming a subscriber and supporting our program. Also, we want to apologize to some of our patrons. We have been derelict on our responsibilities and have not been naming some of the people who have been giving money at a higher level. So for now on, we're going to credit those people at the end of every episode. This is for the patrons who have the alt moderate rebels and extremely moderate rebels levels on Patreon. So a special thanks to the following top tier patrons: Boris Petrovich, Maria Cho, Matthew Hull, Jacob Gels, Leonard Goodman, Brendan Jodwin, Rhonda Fingeret, Liska Ostajik, Ladan Ziai, Ramiro Hail, James Day, Henry Wallace, Bryn Crafty, Vivek Madala, Eigil Muller, Thomas Tate, and Des Magner. Thanks so much. You were listening to and maybe even watching Moderate Rebels. As always, thanks for joining us.